We're gonna do.
Let's go.
Just can you text or chat and say go?
We're live.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm holding a Haggadah. So instead of talking about the weekly Parsha, which is Vayikra, Book of Leviticus, we're going to hop right into the Seder. We're going to hear a lot about the Seder over this coming week. As you can see, I have a pile of books right here. Oh. And we're going to go through some of these because they are all Haggadot. And so today we're going to take a virtual tour through one section of each Haggadah. We're going to take a part of the section of Manishtanah, which of course are the 4 questions, and see how different authors of different Haggadot interpret it according to their time, according to the location. It's interesting that, right, the Haggadah is the same text no matter where you go, with the interpretation of what you are going through, as if Ki'ilu Yatzam Mitzrayim, we came from Egypt. First Haggadah is called A Different Night. It's one of my favorite ones. It's by Noam Tzion and David Dishon. And it starts like this. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. Why is this night different than all other nights? I want to first read the text from the Mishnah that speaks about how we're supposed to do the Ma nishtana. We know, of course, that the youngest child is supposed to. I was number 4 or 5, so I was always exempt for most of my life from the 4 questions. But why the youngest one? And this is where it comes from. The Mishnah says, the Mishnah tells you the order of the Seder. They fill a second cup of wine for him, meaning the leader of the Seder, you fill a second cup of wine. And here the child, the inquisitive child, the one who should ask his parent. If the child lacks da'at, knowledge or intelligence, if the child cannot ask a question, what happens? His father or his parent teaches him. How different is this night from all other nights? From all other nights, we eat leavened bread and matzah, etc. Noam Tzion says a surprising point here is that the 4 questions are not formulated as questions, but rather they are statements of wonder. They are stated by the parent, not the child. And only if the child lacks the intelligence to ask spontaneously. The intelligent child, the chacham, is expected to notice the changes in the routine and inquire about them, right? The intelligent child will get to the meal next Saturday night and say, why is this night different? Oh, I see, we're reclining. Oh, we're dipping twice. Oh, we don't have bread on the table, but we have matzah. According to the to the Mishnah, then, if all children were intelligent and curious, there would be no recital of a ritual text of 4 questions. If everybody could do it themselves, then you wouldn't need a text to actually ask the questions. Nevertheless, Ma Nishtana has still earned a place at our Seder. But one who is satisfied with only a formal recitation of questions is far from realizing the educational potential the rabbis sought to develop. The rabbis didn't just want somebody to read a text, but they wanted somebody to inquire about the differences that were happening in that moment. It's not enough to just read the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a jumping off point. It is a source, a foundation to begin asking the questions that we speak about at our Seder. A famous story is told by a Nobel laureate in physics, Isidore Rabi. He was once asked, why did you become a scientist rather than a doctor, a lawyer, a businessman, like the other immigrant children in your neighborhood? He answered, my mother made me a scientist without ever intending it. Every other Jewish mother would ask her child, so did you learn anything today? But not my mother. She always asked, did you ask a good question today? That difference of making good questions made him a scientist. How do you ask a good question, right? We always hear there are no bad questions, there are only bad answers. That is what the Seder is about. It's about asking the good questions. Another teaching from the Talmud about Ma Nishtana, once the young pupil Abaye was invited to the teacher, his Seder of his teacher, right? He goes to the Seder of who? Of his teacher of all people. While still at the beginning of the Seder, his teacher Rabbah ordered his servants to clear the dishes from the table. Amazed, Abaye the student asked, why are you removing the Seder plate before we have even eaten? His teacher exclaimed, your question has served the same function as Ma Nishtana. Let's dispense with those said questions and proceed directly to the telling of the story. Sometimes you don't have to ask the questions, but it's the action that allows somebody else to ask the question that is the most important thing. So again, yes, millions of Jews around the world will say, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, but how many of us will ask the questions about what is happening at the Seder, in our communities, in our world, in Israel? In every generation, Noam Sion writes, one is obligated to ask new questions, right? We have the four basic ones in the Manishtana, but how do we ask a new question? And so the story is told in the early days, the Kibbutz Haggadah retooled the four questions to transcend ritual issues and focus on contemporary historical concerns, whether it was about the Independence War in 1948, about the Shoah, the Holocaust in the 1940s, or about the ingathering of 1 million Jewish refugees in the 1950s. These are the questions that were asked at Kibbutz Ein Harod in 1930s and 1940s. Tell me, in 2025, almost 100 years later, could you ask these questions today? These were the four questions. Why do people all over the world hate the Jews? When will the Jews return to their land? When will our land become a fertile garden? And when will there be peace and brotherhood world over? That was 1930s and 1940s. Yes, we can still ask those questions in 2025 and here in Los Angeles or wherever you are listening to this morning. Finally, that's the Manishtana from Noam Sion. I want to take you to my favorite Haggadah of all time that I picked up just a couple of years ago. I found this Haggadah in 2007 while I was studying in Israel in the Jaffa flea market. You can see it's sort of torn, it's worn out. The same text, right? I'll show you the Manishtana in just a minute. There it is. Manishtana halayla hazeh on this page. But what I love about this are two things. The first is this map of Israel. Three things. The second is this emblem. I'll start here. This emblem says, Tzva Haganah Yisrael. This was the Haggadah used in the IDF. When? Definitely not in 1948, and definitely not after the Sinai was given back to Egypt. You could see by the map, this is a different map of Israel than we have today. And what I love about this is in the back section, it has musical notations, as you can see. And this right here is Manishtana. And I'm very grateful for my music education because I can read music. And I want to sing for you for a second how the Israeli soldiers, when Israel had the Sinai in their possession, sang Manishtana. It went like this. Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. What does that mean? That the same melodies that I sing with my children here in Los Angeles were the same melodies that the soldiers of Israel were singing. And in fact, this year, it's the same melody that those soldiers will sing, whether they are on the Gaza border, up north by Lebanon and Syria, or in their homes in Jerusalem. That is Manishtana. How we ask those questions. Why is this different? Why is this night different from all other nights? How did my ancestors celebrate Passover? And how are our fellow brothers and sisters all around the world who are Jews celebrating Passover now? I want to take you to this next Haggadah. It's a very new Haggadah, 2 years old, called the Quieting the Silence Haggadah. It's by the Blue Dove Foundation, and it is a Haggadah that is meant to deal with mental health. Mental health. And so when you look at the four questions here, give me 1 second. Let me get there. It's the same questions. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. But if you're having a Seder regarding mental health, this is what you would say. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. This is translated into the language of mental health. Why is this night different from all other nights? Am I still in Egypt today, or am I free? The author writes, mental health is not linear. Most of us oscillate day by day or even hour by hour. How are we doing at this moment? Check in with yourself. Number 2, from which struggles have I freed myself? We all struggle. That's how we grow. What have you done this year that made you proud? How have you grown? What have you done to take care of yourself? Number 3, who in my life can be an outstretched arm? We all struggle. Anxiety, grief, and failure affect us all. When you are struggling, who do you turn to for help, and how do you ask? Choose one person you can trust to help when you're having a bad day. How would you reach out to them? Considering having a conversation with that person about what support might look like. And the last question, what's on my mental health Seder plate? Just as the symbols on the Seder plate keep us engaged with the story of Passover, each of us have self-care tools that keep us engaged with our mental health. The more self-care options we have to improve our mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being, the better prepared we are for the days ahead that we are most vulnerable. What tools do you have front and center in your life? That is a most modern, beautiful Haggadah of mental health of the Blue Dove Foundation. I want to go on to 2 more that I find very interesting. The first may seem childlike, but it really isn't. It's called the Passover Haggadah graphic novel. It is by Ered Sadok and a good friend of Sinai Temple and mine, Jordan B. Gorfinkel. And when he looks at the 4 questions, it goes like this. It's all just the text, but the graphics are so beautiful. Let me just find it here. It is right here, the 4 questions. Here we go. The 4 questions. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh? How different is this night? On all other nights, we are permitted to eat bread or matzah, but tonight only matzah. And you can see it's a beautiful one for not only children, but for adults. It's graphic. It tells the story as it's Comic-Con, as a comic book. And you can actually see, give me 1 second. He puts in historical references when you're telling the story. He has Abraham Joshua Heschel. He has Dr. Martin Luther King. It's a beautiful way to tell the story not only by words, but in fact by pictures. And one last one, actually 2 last ones, I'm sorry. This one is called The Promise of Liberty, a Passover Haggadah, and it is all about the history of America within the context of the Passover Seder. And so when you get to the 4 questions, you learn things such as John Adams, the 2nd President of the United States. Give me 1 second. Sorry. You learn about the history of America and freedom here. And so this is when we are saying, now we are here next year in the land of Israel. This is the commentary. Founding father and former President John Adams had a cordial correspondence with the American Jewish diplomat, Mordechai Emanuel Noah, in the late 1700s. In a letter in 1819 to Noah, Adams expressed his wish that Jews would one day return to inhabit the land of Israel. Led by Noah, who long dreamed of a Jewish national restoration, right? 100 years before Zionism. This is what John Adams wrote. I wish you had continued your travels into Syria, Judea, and Jerusalem. I should attend more to your interesting remarks upon those interesting countries than to those of any traveler I have yet read. If I were to let my imagination loose, I can find it in my heart to wish that you had been at the head of 100,000 Israelites indeed, as well disciplined as a French army and marching them into Judea, for I really wish the Jews again an independent nation. That was 100 years before the Zionist movement. Years later, as you probably are aware, there was always a Seder in the White House. In the White House. The fact that almost 200 years before, America's founding fathers were hoping and wishing that the Jewish people would have a homeland. And a couple hundred years later, today, a Passover Seder exists in the White House from all different types of political administrations. That is a miracle, as good as crossing the sea. And finally, I want to read you from the Koran Haggadah, which is an amazing Haggadah with commentary by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who is just one of the most amazing teachers. And this is what he says on the 4 questions. Not so illustrated, but intellectual. What makes this night different from all other nights? This is what Jonathan Sachs says. The Torah speaks of children asking questions on Pesach. We learn in the book of Exodus, and if your children should ask you, what is this service to you, you shall say, from this tradition inferred the story of Exodus from Egypt must be told, wherever possible, in response to the question asked by a child, wherever possible. This story, no matter if you're in Israel, Los Angeles, Madrid, Mexico, Morocco, anywhere, the story must be told. The Torah, he says, has 2 words for inheritance, Yerusha and Nachala, 2 modern words. But they represent 2 different ways in which a heritage is passed across the generations. Nachala comes from the root nachal, which means a river, right? When you go to Israel on a hike, it's nachal this, nachal that. It represents an inheritance that is merely handed down. It's given to you without any work on part of the recipient, as water flows in a river, right? When you get a nachal, a nachala, I get it just because I was given. I didn't do anything to do. Yerusha, by contrast, means an active inheritance. You have to do something to get it. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch pointed out that la reshet, the verbal form, sometimes means conquer or to capture. It means active taking hold of what has been promised. An inheritance for one which has worked is always more secure than for one which has not. If you work for something, as you know, it's going to be more secure. It's going to be more valuable because you worked for it to get it. That is why Judaism encourages children to ask questions, Rabbi Sachs says. When a child asks, he or she already begun the work of preparing to receive. Torah is a Yerusha. You have to work for it. It's not just giving to you as a nachala. It needs work on behalf of the child if it is to be passed on across the generations. How true it is. After October 7th, we saw a surge in Jewish education. People did not begin Jewish education because they needed it to have a bar and bat mitzvah, but there was a surge because they understood that they needed to work at it in order to get it, in order to inherit it, in order to understand it, in order to use it going forward. And so why is this Manish Shana so beautiful? Rabbi Sachs says the history of Manish Shana is fascinating. The text itself goes back 2,000 years. We know to the Talmud. It's recorded in the Mishnah as we heard originally, and was certainly the form of words used in the Second Temple times. So not only was it used when the Israeli soldiers sang it in the 1950s and 60s in the Haggadah that I showed you, but it was said these same words. When? In the Second Temple. It was said not before the meal, but after. Today we say it before the meal. It was said not by the child, but it was said by the parent, as we explained earlier. And it wasn't a set of questions, it was a statement. So let me repeat that. It wasn't said by a child, but it was said by a parent. It was questions, not questions, but it was statements. And it was said after the meal, not before. How so? In the temple time, Rabbi Sachs said, the meal was eaten first. The sanctity of the moment was palpable. Families had traveled all parts of Israel to bring their sacrifice to the temple and eat meal in Jerusalem, right? Everybody was going to the temple in Jerusalem. They were coming from everywhere. The questions of the child arose naturally from acts done that night that were done at no other point in the year, right? We were doing things so differently. Even last week, I was in Philadelphia at a celebration of a family event, and we went to the kosher supermarket, and already it was kosher for Passover, and people started asking the questions. Why this? Why that? It's not because we were reading a script in the book. It was because we were looking at the actions done. If the child was too young to ask, the father would prompt him by saying, Mani Shana, what makes this night different? And the child would be prompted to ask these questions. But see how different this night is from all other nights. The parents would enumerate the differences, and then the question would be why. We can't rely on our children to just ask the questions, but we have to do in order for them to ask the questions. In the last generation of Jews, often it was called the drop-off generation. Parents would drop off their children at the synagogue because they had to do it. But they wouldn't do it themselves in order for the children to ask. And so how could their children ask their parents questions when the parents themselves were not educated? I'm seeing a beautiful resurgence of parents being involved in education so that they can do things so that they will allow their children to ask. That is the essence of Manishtana. Not sending our kids to a religious school to learn Hebrew so that they can ask them for them, but rather our parents doing that so our children can ask, why are they doing that? Rabbi Sachs concludes one of the most remarkable achievements of the rabbis was to preserve the continuity of Jewish life. In fact, through a series of tragedies, the destruction of the temple, the end of the Passover sacrifice, the loss of the entire atmosphere of collective celebration in Jerusalem, right? It could have been all gone, but the questions are asked because we want to make sure to recover that. The narrative, therefore, was moved from after the meal to before it. So the words would do the work of the place. We no longer had a Jerusalem, but we had the story. Isn't that fascinating? Why do we say the words of Manishtana before the meal? Because we don't have the place of Jerusalem to eat that meal. And so now the story takes the place of the place. But we have the story. And instead of the children asking spontaneously, each in their own words, now we have Manishtana. We have a formula that every child can count on. Old words took a new function. A ritual once celebrated in the vicinity of the Kotel, the Western Wall, the Jerusalem, became a ceremony that could be everywhere around the world. And we could still have the original character of the ceremony. Everywhere Jews gathered to celebrate Passover, it became a part of Jerusalem. The city, the land, the sacrificial order lay in ruins, but the words remained. One thing achieved by turning Manishtana into a formula was that now there was no division of children into the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the child, unable to ask. In a beautiful way, the custom ordained that every child should ask in the same way using the same words, so the child should not be put to shame. All Jewish children are precious, and we do not distinguish between them. Wow. What Rabbi Sachs says is so beautiful, right? The original Seder, in fact, is not the Seder that we have today, but it was turned around on its head so that we could connect to the original Seder thousands of years ago. And so I hope, as we wish you a Chag Sameach, that we pray for a season of asking questions, not just reading them from a book, but prompting you to ask questions from the heart. Look around you in the world we live in today. Ask 4 new questions of why this world today we live in is different than the world that we lived in last year, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or a decade ago, or a century ago, or a generation ago. Put yourself in the story, Ke'ilu, as if you walked through our ancestors' shoes from Egypt, eventually with